الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our adult viewers and a very special welcome to our young and young adult viewers. Welcome to the program 30 Lessons. Welcome to episode number 9, program, A Role in Reconstructing Al-Kaaba. When the Prophet ﷺ reached 35 years old, Mecca was pounded with torrential rains, and this caused a great deal of flooding, and floodwaters swept toward Al-Kaaba al-Sharifa. And by this time, the Kaaba was a very old structure. You have to think that Ibrahim had completed and his son Ismail had completed the construction of Al-Kaaba centuries before that. And it still remained in the same form as when Ibrahim and his son Ismail had constructed it. In addition to that, the pagans, they had this tradition that every year they would clothe the Kaaba with a kiswa. Like, you know, they have the kiswa now, that black kiswa that has the Quranic writing on it. And they have a kiswa too. It wasn't obviously, but they would put a clothing or a cloth on it. And every year they would put another cloth, and they wouldn't remove the previous cloth. So ultimately what happened is that two things are happening. The structure itself, just by natural erosion due to the environment, and more weight is after year with the kiswa. So 5 years old, this structure was very weak. Those torrential rains came to Mecca, the structure, floodwaters rushed toward the Kaaba and enveloped it, and its already weak structure and foundation was eroded even more by the rain waters. And basically this flood threatened to demolish the Kaaba and left it once the rain passed on and the storm passed and the flood water subsided. It left the Kaaba a very weak structure, a structure that people feared would ultimately collapse on its own. And so basically the pagans of Mecca, Quraysh, and the other clans, they basically felt like we have to rebuild the Kaaba in order to safeguard its holy. So what they started to do, obviously, if we're going to rebuild the structure, we have to have funds. Okay, it's going to cost money to do that. So they accept lawful earnings because this is the house of Allah. We can't rebuild it with illicit funds. We can't rebuild it from funds that have been basically gathered from illegal trades. And that's because the pagans, not all of the work that they did and not all the ways and means that they had to raise money were legal. They had a lot of illegal things that they engaged in that I won't mention here because we have young people, but they did a lot of illegal things. And that's how they made money. But they knew they couldn't put those monies made from illegal, illicit types of work and occupations and trade, they couldn't put that money into making a mosque, making the house of Allah. So they made a condition. We're only going to accept funds that come from lawful types of employment. And so once they established that, they had made enough money, collected enough funds to build the mosque. They set out to build it, but obviously, before they built it up again, they had to demolish the original structure. So they fixed a day, and they all came with their tools to demolish the Kaaba. And they stood there in awe and fear. Nobody wanted to be the first one to what? Or a pickaxe or something to the Kaaba, fearing that the wrath of Allah might what? Might inflict them. And it was not so long ago, before the Prophet was born, exactly the year that the Prophet was born, that an army came with elephants to demolish the Kaaba, and they were obliterated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by stones that came from the heavens. And so they started saying to themselves that, look, we don't want any part of that from Allah. And so therefore they were all afraid. They stood there afraid until one of them, Walid ibn al-Mughira, and struck the Kaaba. And when nothing happened to him, one by one began to come forward and strike the Kaaba and bring it down. And ultimately they leveled it. And once they leveled it and reached the foundations which were laid by Ibrahim alayhi salam, they began to what? To reconstruct it, and they divided the parts, and each tribe was responsible for part of the Kaaba so that they could equally participate in its reconstruction. And no tribe could say that I had more of a role in it, or only my tribe rebuilt it. No, all the that they shared in the rebuilding of or reconstruction of Al-Kaaba. And the supervisor of this exercise, of this endeavor, was a Roman mason by the name. Why? Because the Romans were known for masonry and was known for trade and commerce. Engineering was not their thing. And so rather than just build the structure, they wanted to bring a professional who could supervise it and make sure it was done right. So the work went on in peace. And everything was fine. They reconstructed the Kaaba. Everything was fine until they got to the point where they needed to put the black stone back. This is where the conflict broke out amongst the chiefs. A single tribe wanted to have the honor of placing the black stone in its place. And so there was this conflict, and at first it was just discussion, and then discussion went to argument. Argument went to threat. Argument moved or escalated to threats of violence, and pretty soon it looked like an all-out war was going to break out amongst the chiefs over who would put the black stone in its place. Until what happened ultimately, cooler heads prevailed, and a man by the name of Abu Umayyah ibn Mughira al-Makhzumi, he made a proposal. He said, let us appoint as an arbiter the first person who enters the holy sanctuary. None of us knows who that's going to be. And so we're not basically tipping the scales in favor of our own tribe. Whoever comes in, the first one who comes in, he will arbitrate between us and we'll accept his decision. So they all thought that was a good idea, and they agreed to operate accordingly. And guess who the first man to come into the Kaaba was, or to the holy sanctuary? It was Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So when he came in, they all erupted in pleasure, in acceptance for the Prophet ﷺ. And they said, Al-Amin, Al-Amin, the trustworthy one, we are content with whatever he decides. They were happy with him. They knew he was impartial, he was objective, he was fair, and he was wise. So they said, yeah, whatever he decides, we'll accept it. So the Prophet ﷺ, he proposed, he said, bring a large cloth or sheet, and we will put the stone in it. And each tribe will appoint a chief or a member who will carry or will grasp one end of the sheet. So all of the tribes will have a share in carrying the stone to its spot and basically putting it in its place. And then ultimately they lifted it up to the actual place or the niche where it goes, and the Prophet pushed it in with his blessed hand, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And in this way, through his wisdom, a very tense situation was eased and grave danger was averted by the wisdom of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it bears mentioning in closing that Quraysh, because they were insistent that only legal funds would be used for the reconstruction of the Kaaba, they ran out of money. They didn't have enough money to rebuild the Kaaba on its exact foundations the way Ibrahim and Ismail had built it. So what they were forced to do was to build what they could, that cube, as much as they could, and then to the remaining part that they weren't able to build with almost what looks like a horseshoe. And you've seen this on some of the pictures, I'm sure you have. And they call that al-hijr or al-hatim. So that little horseshoe is actually this used to be part of the Kaaba, but the funds were so short, or deficient, that we're only able to build up this much. But so the people would worship and circle the Kaaba according to the proper distance and circumference, where the Kaaba was when Ibrahim and Ismail first built it. Learn from what we heard today. There are a few lessons, brothers and sisters, and we'll mention them ala ujala. The first one is that the pagan Arabs, these people who were from a period which was known as the period of Jahili, the period of ignorance, the people who had no knowledge of religion, they had enough knowledge of religion to know the difference between right and wrong. And they knew some things about right and wrong that some Muslims don't even know today. They knew, Inna Allah tayyib la yaqbalu illa. Allah is good, and He only accepts that which is good. You can't put illicit funds into a masjid. They knew that. And unfortunately, some Muslims today don't know that. Another lesson we get is that the idolaters, the mushrikun, they feared Allah. They were afraid of Allah. So the fact that they worshipped idols didn't mean that they didn't believe in God and didn't fear Him, and that they didn't feel that God was God. But they just felt that He also partners. Clear proof that they had the fear of Allah was that when they were about to demolish the Kaaba, none of them wanted to step forward. They all feared that what? The wrath of Allah might come down upon them for bringing down His house. Another lesson we get is that people of the pre-Islamic period knew the excellence, virtue, and merit of building and maintaining the masajid. They felt like this was something, a virtuous deed, to the point that they competed with each other in rebuilding the Kaaba and donating money to rebuild Al-Kaaba Al-Sharifa. Also, another lesson we get from this lesson is the importance of respecting specialization. Notice the pagans were businessmen by trade. The pagans of Mecca were businessmen by trade. They didn't know anything about engineering and building buildings. And so they brought a engineer, a brick mason, a specialist in structure building. They brought that structural engineer. They brought him to oversee the construction of the Kaaba to make sure it was done correctly. So they had respect for specialization, and Muslims in general were supposed to have respect for specialization, which is why Allah tells us in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge. If you do not know, it means what? In every discipline, ask the people who are the specialists and experts in that discipline if you are not an expert in that discipline. So in Islamic studies, we ask the Islamic scholar. When it comes to engineering, we ask the engineer. When it comes to medicine, we ask the doctor, and so on. Another lesson was that the Prophet ﷺ was known for his impeccable integrity and his unimpeachable record of honesty, long before he proclaimed his prophethood. And he was never known in his life to tell a single lie. And this is a repeat of a lesson we learned yesterday, is that this is one of the clearest signs that the Prophet of Allah, Muhammad ﷺ, was truly the Prophet of Allah. Lish, because how could he spend his whole life avoiding lying out of fear of the consequences, what people might say about him, that he's not a truthful person, and then at 40 years old begin to lie about Allah, not fearing the consequences in the hereafter for lying on Allah. So that's a clear indication a person who told the truth to people about people and about worldly things, fearing the worldly consequences for 40 years, is not going to now start lying on Allah and not fearing the consequences in the hereafter. And last but not least from the lessons, it is better to do part of something well as opposed to doing the whole thing poorly. We see that they weren't able to complete the construction of the Kaaba, and they didn't say they're going to rebuild it. Didn't do what? Didn't rebuild it, but what? Rebuild it in a way which was not what? Which was not done. They did what they could do well, and the remainder they what? They filled in with what we call al-hatim or al-hijr. It teaches us the lesson. It's better to do something, do part of something well, as opposed to doing all of it poorly. We conclude our lesson for today. Thank you for joining us, and inshallah ta'ala we'll see you tomorrow for another lesson, another episode. Until then, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be from those who He blesses with beneficial knowledge and benefits us by making He has taught us. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبي محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.